into the relationship just much more clear on where they're at, and likely how they're going to show up in a relationship, and whether that's something you want to F with them. And this is why I have a real issue, especially in some of the like masculine and feminine energy discourse where there's kind of this expectation that you need to be the same everywhere. Like if you're in your feminine energy out in the world, you need to be in your feminine energy in your relationships and vice versa. Like realistically, like according to astrology, that is not how it works. Welcome back to the Wildings Astro Tarot YouTube channel for another astrology video, this time on how to read masculine and feminine energies in the chart, and also how to read masculine and feminine dynamics with other people in the chart. And y'all might be wondering, why the friggity frack do I need to read masculine and feminine energy in the chart? Well, there's a few reasons. First of all, like it can really help to understand someone's dynamic before you get involved with them. To see if they're going to practically fit into your life. So it's really good in a relational sense more than anything else. For example, if your vision for your life and your relationships is something like super like kind of equal, no real gender roles, being with someone who has more of a balanced masculine and feminine energy is a much better kind of starting off point in a relationship. If your goal is to have a very balanced relationship, very balanced in terms of like the roles that you take in that relationship, being with someone that's heavily polarized into a masculine or feminine energy is gonna be a bit counterproductive. Like you're gonna be spending the whole relationship just fighting essentially. So you can go into the relationship just much more clear on where they're at, and likely how they're gonna show up in a relationship, and whether that's something you want to F with or not. Like you can kind of read it at face value a little bit sooner and yeet yourself out of it if it's not the right thing for you. And likewise, if you're like more of a divine feminine, you can read whether someone has that divine masculine energy or not, and vice versa. Like if you're a divine masculine and it's really important that you are with someone with more of those kind of feminine energies and are more likely to want to take on that feminine role, you can find someone and read whether or not they have a lot of feminine energy in their chart, before you invest a lot of time, and before you get yourself into a situation where y'all might just be fighting about this sort of stuff. And this is, I personally find this is definitely something that people do tend to fight about. So it's just like good to know up front about whether you're going to be compatible, in regards to like energies. Like, are you going to be energetically aligned with this other person? The other thing that's super helpful to be able to read masculine and feminine energy for is to kind of be able to get ahead of kind of what kind of dynamic you're likely to experience in a connection with someone, even if you are energetically compatible. Like after you've determined whether you're energetically compatible or not, you can kind of read like how your energies might play out together. First, like very generally, because there is kind of like a general vibe that masculine energy tends to go through in the world, and a general vibe that feminine energy tends to go through in the world. People with more of a balanced energy tend to have a bit of a mix of both. But then there's also things that you can look at in the chart to see how your particular brand of masculine, feminine energy, or both, would play out with another person. And this is super helpful for things like soulmate connections, twin flame connections, especially if you're in one of those connections, particularly twin flame. There tends to be a very clear like masculine energy and very clear feminine energy. You can kind of get ahead of it and understand who's going to play what role and what you're likely to experience. It's like just good to kind of prepare you. And personally, I also find it helpful to keep you on track as well during relationships. Like for example, in one of my past relationships, like we definitely came into the connection. I was in my feminine, she was in her masculine. However, when things started to get like a bit hectic in the relationship and stuff started to come up, I definitely like felt really vulnerable in my feminine in that connection. And so sometimes I would kind of like go into the masculine energy in it from a place of defensiveness, and like vice versa for her. And so when you're in relationships, and I think in a moment where you can be in that opposite energy, like having something like this can be very grounding to remind you to come back to your authentic self. So you don't kind of get lost in being in the wrong, not the wrong energy, but being in the other polarization, like from a non-authentic place. I'm like so glad that I was in my masculine energy for a bit and had that experience, but I just don't think I would have been in it for as long or has been as confused, or like, yeah, I think I was kind of like keeping myself from like purpose, joy, flow, things like that by doing that. So I think it can be also grounding as well, like kind of a touch point to come back to when you're in relationships and things get very like murky, dark, gray, like confusing, like you can get real twisted around and like, yeah, in more of an ego place instead of an authentic place. Like it's a good kind of like reference point if ever you get like a bit twisted in a relationship. So in this video, I'm going to take you through a few things. I'm going to show you where your masculine and feminine energy is in your astrological chart. I'll show you how to determine whether you lean more masculine, lean more feminine, or are more androgynous in terms of your energy, whether you're a mix of the two. And then also I'll show you how to kind of interpret kind of your brand of masculine and feminine energy, because people's masculine and feminine energy, like while there's a kind of like overview of those things, like everyone's masculine and feminine energy is a little bit different. And so, yeah, you've kind of got to interpret your particular flavor of masculine or feminine energy or both in the chart as well. And then I'll also walk you through how to like put two charts together and figure out what the dynamic is going to be based on your personal masculine and feminine energy, their personal masculine and feminine energy, and then how they interact on a synastry chart, because that kind of changes some stuff too. It's not just about placements. So yeah, that's going to be this video. So if you're interested in learning how to read masculine and feminine energy in your personal chart and learning how to read a masculine and feminine dynamic with other people in synastry charts, let's get into it. So the first thing we need to know is where the masculine and feminine energy comes from in the chart. So essentially, the big five is the main place that your masculine and feminine energy are going to come from. Jupiter and Saturn are very social planets, but they're like too broadly social, so they're not really going to give you a good indication of your masculine and feminine energy. And likewise, generational planets, way too broad. You're not going to get your masculine and feminine energy from there. You're going to get your masculine and feminine energy from your big five. In particular, you're mostly going to get it from your Sun, Moon, Venus, and Mars, and they contribute to your masculine and feminine energy in different ways. And it's kind of like your rising sign's kind of like the final thing, but that's kind of like the last place that you look. So where you get most of your feminine energy from is your Moon and Venus placements, and where you get most of your masculine energy from is your Sun and Mars placements. And so the very first thing that you take into consideration before you take into consideration anything else is you simply look at how dominant those placements are in your chart. So people who tend to have their Sun and Mars as more dominant placements than their Venus and Moon tend to have more of a masculine energy. People who have their Moon and Venus more dominant than their Sun and Mars tend to have more of a feminine energy. So to find out what your dominant placements are, you're first going to go to a site like Astro that calculates dominant placements in your chart. And you can disregard anything that's happening with the social planets, Saturn and Jupiter. You can disregard anything that's happening with the generational planets, and you can also disregard Mercury. And you're mostly just going to be looking at the order in which Sun, Moon, Mars, and Venus are dominant in your chart. So the first thing you're going to do is literally just order everything from most dominant to least dominant out of those four placements. So for example, if I pull up my chart and look at my dominance tab, my moon is my most dominant placement out of those 4 placements. Then you've got Venus, Sun, and Mars. So my feminine placements are more dominant than my masculine placements in my chart, and this is going to predispose me to more feminine energy. In contrast, when I bring up Carrie's chart, her order of dominance is first her Mars, then her Sun, then her Moon, then her Venus. So she is much more predisposed to a masculine energy. But sometimes it's not that simple. Sometimes you don't have your feminine placements more dominant than your masculine, or your masculine more dominant than your feminine. For example, you might have masculine, feminine, or feminine, masculine. And so this is why the next step is pretty important. So you always want to give kind of like a little bit of extra credit to whatever the most dominant of those 4 placements are, especially if it's highlighted in blue, because that means it's one of your 3 most dominant placements in your whole chart. So for example, my most dominant placement is my moon. Carrie's most dominant placement is her Mars. So it kind of confirms that yes, I'm going to lean feminine. Yes, she's going to lean masculine. And then this also helps, especially if you have a situation where it might go masculine, feminine, masculine, or the inverse, because you're giving that first one a little bit of extra buzz. Because definitely it could get confusing otherwise, or else you'd be like, well, I've got the most dominant in this, but also the least dominant. It makes it a little bit more murky when you take into consideration that the top one should always be more valued, taken more seriously than the next 3. Then it helps. So if you were, for example, like Mars, Moon, Venus, Sun, you're going to lean masculine because the most dominant placement is a masculine placement. And even though you have the 2 next dominant placements feminine, like that first most dominant placement is going to give you that extra boost, and like you're probably going to come across a bit androgynous anyway, just based on this. Obviously there's a lot more we can go into, but like at least then you know which way you lean. Then next we can start to take into consideration our experience of our own masculine and feminine energy, because the sun and the moon are a different kind of masculine and feminine energy than the Venus and Mars. The sun and the moon is our masculine and feminine energy that is more about a bigger picture masculine and feminine energy. It's more how we show up in the world, kind of generally, like personally, a little bit more broadly. Like it's not specifically relational. Which I think is why, personally, that's my theory of why sun sign astrology is so like dominant in our culture, because we obviously live in a very masculine world, and so our sun sign's very like the most compatible with the masculine world we live in, which I think is why we ask each other our sun signs these days, when back in the day we used to ask each other our rising signs, which makes sense in a different way based on the time that was kind of the dominant like astrology placement that you would ask for. In contrast, our Venus and Mars placements more have to do with who we are as relational beings, especially our sexual and romantic relationships with other people. Definitely in a one-on-one sense, it can be a little bit broader than that, but when it comes to masculine and feminine relational dynamics, Venus and Mars are going to be more telling of what that's going to be like for you than the sun and the moon. And getting our day-to-day masculine and feminine energy from a different place than our more relational masculine and feminine energy can explain some of the difference and some of the nuance as to why, for example, some people show up very differently out in the world, but then show up like totally opposite in their romantic relationships. Having that distinction between the 2 places that we get different kinds of masculine and feminine energy can explain some of that. Like, for example, say you're a sun dominant person and say you also have your sun in a more masculine sign. This is going to give you a lot of masculine day-to-day energy. But if you have your Mars and Venus, say both in feminine signs, and maybe the next most dominant, then you might show up to your relationships, especially sexual and romantic ones, way more in your feminine energy. And this is why I have a real issue, especially in some of the like masculine and feminine energy discourse, where there's kind of this expectation that you need to be the same everywhere. Like if you're in your feminine energy out in the world, you need to be in your feminine energy in your relationships, and vice versa. Like realistically, like according to astrology, that is not how it works. Like, you can be like authentically masculine out in the world and authentically feminine like in your romantic relationships, or vice versa, like authentically feminine in the world, authentically masculine in your relationships. You could be masculine in the world, masculine relationships, feminine in the world, feminine relationships. There's so many different combinations. And yeah, I think the kind of like black and white thinking, no nuance, like it just, I don't think it helps people. Like, I think like variety is the spice of life. Like, we've got to all be able to like be different, do different. Like, yeah, that's a bit of a rant. But yeah, there's going to be a difference for some people of how they're showing up in the world and romantically, and that's like, it's supposed to be like that. It is what it is, and it's beautiful, normal, natural, like it's in the stars. Like, don't worry about the pressure that other people in the world are putting on you to be the same in both places if it doesn't feel authentic, especially if you can see in your chart that it's not authentic for you to show up in the same energy in both places. Like, it, like, you do you, and like just be yourself. Like, I promise, like, the stars set this up like this for a reason. It allows for variety for a reason, and embrace it. So the next step is going to be looking at your astrology chart to see if there's going to be that distinction for you. So for example, when I look at my chart, I can look at my sun versus my moon and ignore my Mars and Venus just to see my masculine and feminine energy out in the world. And you can see that my moon is obviously more dominant than my sun. So out in the world, I'm more dominant in my feminine energy than I am in my masculine generally as a starting off point. And then I look at my relationship placement. So I look at Mars and Venus alone, and in that regard, my Venus is more dominant than my Mars. So again, in relationships, I'm going to, at the very least, to start off with as a jumping off point, lean more feminine. To contrast, when you look at Carrie's chart, her sun is more dominant than her moon, so she's going to lean more masculine out in the world. When you look at her Mars and her Mars is more dominant than her Venus, so she's going to also lean more masculine in her relationships. So showing up more the same in the world and in relationships is much more of a given when you had a situation when we were looking at all four placements where it was both your masculine, then both your feminine, or vice versa, both your feminine, both your masculine. Obviously looking at the placement, positions, interactions and things can change that slightly, but for the most part, as a jumping off point, like if that was your setup with your dominance list, like you're probably mostly going to lean towards showing up the same in the world and in relationships. However, if you were in a situation when we looked at all four dominant placements where it might have gone masculine, feminine, or masculine, feminine, masculine, or vice versa, then you're more likely to be in a situation where your jumping off point might be different, showing up differently in relationships as you do in the world. So for example, if your moon is more dominant than your sun, but your Mars is more dominant than your Venus, you might show up in the world quite feminine, but show up in relationships quite masculine. And again, there's nuance based on like what signs these placements fall in and how the dynamic actually works out in a synastry chart and where things end up being placed on each other's charts. But as a like general jumping off point, that's going to be your rule of thumb. But now's the time where we start to look into more of the nuance. So to look into more of the nuance, the first thing you're going to take into consideration is what signs your masculine and feminine placements fall into. So your masculine and feminine placements are either going to fall in a sign that's conducive to its energy or counterproductive to its energy. So for example, if you have a sun or a Mars in any of the air and fire signs, that's quite conducive to your masculine energy. If you have a moon and Venus in any of the water and earth signs, that's conducive to your feminine energy. However, if they're reversed, so you have masculine placements in feminine signs, feminine placements in masculine signs, this is where you start to get a little bit of gray area where you might have like a little bit more of an androgynous vibe at times. So for example, Carrie has both of her masculine placements in feminine signs and feminine placements in masculine signs, and that's what gives her energy a little bit more of that androgynous feeling. However, since her masculine placements are more dominant than her feminine placements, you can kind of feel that masculine energy always going to kind of shine through as like an undercurrent. In contrast, when you look at my placements, I have my moon in a feminine sign, sun in a masculine sign, and then I have both my Venus and Mars in feminine signs. And so how this is going to show up is that obviously in relationships, given that both my Mars and Venus are both in feminine signs, and I'm also Venus dominant in general, I'm going to be easily read as very feminine in relationships. However, in the world, obviously, I'm very moon dominant, much more moon dominant than I am sun dominant. So I'm going to show up like very in my feminine in the world as well. However, the masculine energy that I do use in the world, because my sun is in a fire sign, like it's just going to be a little bit more conducive. So you're going to feel a little bit more masculine energy from me in the world because of that compatibility than you would necessarily feel with me in relationships. And there is a crazy number of like ways that these can play out. Like you are now starting to get into territory where there's lots of different combinations and where you're really going to start to create kind of unique situations in an individual of like how their masculine and feminine energy plays out. While I can't take you through every possible combination of things that can happen here, it's just like literally too much for a single video. As long as you keep coming back to the basics that we've already discussed, like keep coming back to, okay, Sun and Mars are masculine, Moon, Venus, feminine, the air and fire signs masculine, earth and water signs feminine, what's more dominant, Sun and Moon more out in the world, Venus and Mars more in relationships. As long as you keep coming back to those rules of thumb, you can start to generate like very unique interpretations for masculine and feminine energy for individuals. I think I might actually add this to my mini readings because yes, as long as you're following these steps, it's fairly straightforward, but also it does help to have an astrologer like interpret them. So I might add them on just as a little side note. I'm most likely going to make these available for you if like it just feels overwhelming, especially if you've got lots of like contradictions and things kind of contradicting themselves. Like for example, if Carrie's dominance were like less leaning masculine, like her chart would just be full of contradictions, more so than it already is, and it does have quite a lot. So some charts are like harder to read in this regard than others. So if you're one of those people where it's starting to get super complicated for you, I can help you with it. So check out my description box to see, first of all, if my readings are open at this time, which as I'm recording this, they are. And then also you can check, I most likely will add masculine and feminine energy readings to my mini readings. So you can always book one with me if it's starting to get too much. The very last thing I wanted to add in this section about reading the personal masculine and feminine energy in a single chart, before we move on to talking about relational dynamics and how the masculine and feminine energies interact with other people, is that if you are an individual that is in that situation where there's lots of contradiction and you are looking for a tiebreaker, the very last thing that you look at is your rising sign. So if your rising sign is in any of the fire and air signs, that can break you more towards the masculine side, swing you more towards the masculine pendulum. And if your rising sign is in any of the feminine signs, which is the earth and water signs, that can swing you more into the feminine. However, if overall your chart is very androgynous, very 50-50, like it's going to be a very slight association with one or the other. It's very, very normal for people to have very balanced charts in terms of their masculine and feminine energy. Lots of people out in the world are very balanced in their masculine and feminine energy. It's not uncommon. It's, I think, just based on society, gender roles, things like that. I think we think people are more masculine versus feminine in their energy than they actually are, if anything. So yeah, like it's very like it's cool if you've got very balanced energy. It's like I would consider it sacred. I think there's a reason why lots of especially indigenous cultures treat very balanced energies as sacred. So yeah, that's kind of like your last little tiebreaker is looking at the rising sign to see if you kind of like just have an affiliation with one more so than the other. And even then, like sometimes there is a little bit of gray area with that as well, especially if you're like, say for example, a Libra rising or Scorpio rising, because some signs like that, obviously like air is masculine, water is feminine. However, Libra is also Venus ruled, which has an obvious very feminine quality to it. And Mars, Scorpio is Mars ruled, which has a masculine quality to it. And if you're like androgynous all the way through, it's like very 50-50 all the way through, like embrace that. That's like, I love that for you. And sometimes that's just the way it is. So yeah, that's your last tiebreaker, but now we'll move on to interpreting masculine and feminine energy more in relationship dynamics and in synastry charts. So for the last piece of the puzzle, you're going to start with literally just thinking about how two people are going to come to a connection based on what they each have going on in their individual charts. So for example, with mine and Carrie's synastry, we're obviously coming into that connection with my energy leaning much more feminine and much more convincingly, whereas her energy leans masculine, and I would say like it definitely leans masculine, but I would say much less convincingly than mine. Because even though like I obviously have like 3 of my 4 placements in feminine signs, my 2 feminine placements are more dominant than my 2 masculine signs. I'm also a Virgo rising, which again leans feminine. Carrie has both of her masculine placements more dominant than her feminine placements, which is what makes her lean masculine, at least initially. However, she has both her feminine placements in masculine signs, masculine placements in feminine signs, and she's one of the 2 main rising signs that things are a little bit less like convincing in terms of a tiebreaker. So Libra and Scorpio risings are less convincing based on kind of the energy of their ruling planet and how important those particular planets are to your masculine and feminine energy. So she's much more closer to balanced. And so when we come into a connection, like immediately going to consider that I'm going to come into that connection like heavy in my feminine, whereas she's going to come into that connection like definitely in her masculine, but not to the strength or polarity that I'm coming into that connection. For all intents and purposes, you're going to consider me the feminine energy and her the masculine energy. With that, you can kind of have a general idea of like what the overview of the dynamic is, but then you're going to start to look at individual placements and what placements kind of interact most across synastry charts, and then also thinking about their signs, their aspects, things like that, to get a little bit more nuanced about how that masculine feminine dynamic might show up in this particular unique circumstance, and where there's some kind of very connection specific masculine feminine dynamics at play. So once you've identified who's most likely to take on a more feminine role, who's more likely to take on the more masculine role when the 2 people come into connection and when they start to polarize each other, keeping in mind that if both parties have very mixed energy, like it's very 50-50 on both sides, you might notice that it kind of goes back and forth, which is again normal. But in this case where someone's kind of definitely leaning more feminine, someone else is definitely leaning more masculine, then you're going to start to consider like how certain placements interact across synastry charts. So the general rule of thumb is that your sun sign will chase the other person's moon sign and your Mars sign will chase the other person's Venus sign. So they're kind of like the 2 kind of divine pairs. But again, it's kind of like similar in the context as when we were looking at individual charts. The Venus and Mars are much more relational. They have a lot more to do with like our romantic and sexual energy with other people. So you're kind of considering that first and foremost, and you're kind of making that a little bit more important. The sun and the moon, like you're looking at that second, and that will be more like how you guys literally just like live together. Like that can be a little bit more like roommates, platonic energy. Like, how do you actually survive especially in today's like era of the nuclear family? Like, how do you like interact more, like how do you just make your practical life work? It's less about your relationship dynamic, and it's has a much less influence on like how you'll be together, like sexually, romantically, things like that. Like they influence a little bit, but consider them less. So you're going to start with looking at the dynamic between each other's Mars and Venus, first and foremost, when you're looking at the dynamic between each other's masculine and feminine energy. And remembering that Mars, the masculine energy, chases the feminine energy or pursues the feminine energy. And each person's Mars is like leans a little bit more like sexual pursuer. Each person's feminine energy leans more romantic receiver. And so if you look at mine and Carrie's charts, for example, I'm a Cancer Mars, she's an Aries Venus, and these are going to be blocked. So my ability to chase her sexually and romantically is going to be blocked. And it's blocked for two reasons. It won't always be blocked for two reasons. Sometimes it'll be blocked for one or the other. And it's blocked for two reasons. First of all, because they're not super compatible in regards to like my masculine energy obviously falls into a feminine sign, and her feminine energy falls into a masculine sign. So they're blocked in that way. Like we're both going to be able to, like, we're both like struggling to do that thing. Like my masculine pursuer energy is like weak in itself. And so trying to go up against her feminine energy being in a masculine sign, also being weak, like her ability to kind of like receive in that feminine's a little bit weak. They're just going to have the hardest time doing that. And then the second reason why they're blocked is because these placements are in squared signs. They don't actually like sit right to actually square each other like intensely. But anytime you have like squares and oppositions, this just creates some challenge. Sometimes, I think more so when it's an opposition, it can create tension, which is nice. But in any harsher aspect, so any red lines in a synastry chart, it's just going to indicate there's going to be a block there. Like my Cancer Mars will have a really hard time pursuing her Aries Venus. However, when you look at her masculine energy, so her Pisces Mars pursuing my feminine energy, which is my Capricorn Venus, these two are much, much, much more compatible. So not only are we not blocked, but these two placements are actually conducive to that kind of energy direction for her masculine energy pursuing my feminine energy. And they're compatible for a few reasons, and those are that first and foremost, they're in compatible signs. So because she's a Pisces Mars and I'm a Capricorn Venus, they're both feminine signs, they are quite compatible within themselves. The second is because those signs actually sextile one another, which is a harmonious aspect, a conducive aspect for the transfer of energy. So her masculine energy is having a much easier time pursuing my feminine energy. And the third reason is it's also compatible with our overall relational kind of dynamic expectation. So going into the connection, you're expecting like her masculine energy to be able to pursue my feminine energy, or well, you're hoping for that because I lean feminine, she leans masculine. So that's the dynamic you're hoping to create. So like, even though we have a block in one way, it's like a good block because it allows us to be ourselves in that connection. If it was the opposite, so if she was a masculine energy, I was a feminine energy, and we had a more conducive transfer of energy from my masculine to her feminine and a less conducive transfer of energy from her masculine to my feminine, that would create an awkward dynamic because it would kind of feel like we couldn't be ourselves because that's kind of not the energy that we're coming in with. Whatever energy you're coming in with, you want the dynamics that are set up in the chart to kind of mirror that, for it to feel like both people can be themselves and that they can pursue each other in a way that feels authentic. So that's why I'm really not worried about my masculine energy being blocked from chasing a feminine energy. It's just kind of like right for the connection. And that's not to say that you can't have a connection with someone where it's not like that. Like if you come into a connection where you're the feminine, they're the masculine, or vice versa, and the actual placements that you have in your chart are more conducive to the alternative energy, you can do it. It just helps to be really conscious, and you just need to be kind of safeguarding against like not feeling like yourself and not feeling authentic and not feeling like you can show up well. So it's just something, and this is why this is good to know, because that might be like a bit of an amber flag in terms of getting involved in something with something. Like, you can expect a lot of challenges in that relationship. But once you've looked at how your energies interact in a more like romantic, sexual like setting, you can look at how your sun and your moon interact to give you more information about like kind of how you interact more on a like day-to-day kind of vibe. And so for this, you're going to look at how each other's sun chases each other's moon. And so again, when you look at mine and Carrie's charts, for example, I'm a Sagittarius sun, she's a Gemini moon. So again, this is kind of blocked. It's not as blocked as our Mars-Venus synastry, because they're obviously both in the same, not in the same element, they're in the same polarity. So they get along well in that regard. However, my masculine energy will have a little bit of a difficult time chasing her feminine energy more in the day-to-day, given that they're at an opposition from one another, and they're in a more tight opposition than some of the other placements that I've already spoken about. So it's a little bit more intense, that they're closer to a exact opposition than some of the aspects that I've spoken about so far. So this will like make it challenging for my masculine energy to chase her feminine energy. But again, I'm not worried. They're slightly more compatible like in the day-to-day stuff than they were compatible, my masculine and her feminine in a sexual sense. However, yeah, it's not all sunshine and rainbows for my masculine trying to chase her feminine in the day-to-day. And because there is that opposition, that can create tension. Sometimes there's a good aspect of the tension. I find the good aspect comes out a little bit more in the masculine feminine placement, so in the Mars and the Venus, because there's natural polarity between them. So that kind of like push-pull polarity opposition kind of, to me, it feels a bit nicer in that regard. In the day-to-day stuff, I think it can be a little bit kind of tense and challenging to have that opposition. The good news is they are on sister signs, so there's kind of like this undercurrent of like kind of getting each other. Like sister signs do kind of vibe, so it's kind of like it's not all good, not all bad. It's just it does create a block. Like my masculine energy will be blocked from trying to chase her feminine in the day-to-day for sure. However, when you look at her masculine energy, so her sun chasing my feminine energy, so my moon, these two are much, much, much more compatible. So because she's a Pisces sun that's in a water sign and a yin element, I'm a Taurus moon, which is an earth sign, also in the yin element. They're compatible that way. They're also sextiling each other, so the energy moves in that direction really easily. It's a harmonious aspect, so her sun energy can chase my moon energy like really well. And again, because I lean more feminine in the dynamic, she leans more masculine, that's like really conducive for us to be our authentic selves, both in the like kind of sexual romantic setting, but then also in the just like day-to-day living our life setting. Like they're both compatible with our natural energy, so we should be able to feel like we can be our authentic selves, and that the energy, like the way we want to move through the world with our energy, is the way that our synastry chart allows that energy to move naturally. So our synastry chart is a really good example of how, especially how having a block in the energy actually can be a good thing, because it creates that environment that's very conducive to people being their authentic selves, and being able to move through the world and move through the connection like as authentic as possible. So definitely don't be afraid when there's blocks. It's okay if there's blocks, especially if the blocks are like saying a similar story that your overall energy is saying. Like it can really help. The only real time to be a little bit concerned is when it's in the opposite way than what your natural energy is. So because I'm feminine, she's masculine, if it was happening opposite, where my masculine energy was unblocked in chasing her feminine energy and vice versa, that would be where I would have cause for concern, and where I might wonder about the longevity of the connection if we're going to make it, because it's just a much more challenging dynamic heading into it. Like, you just have to be really conscious of that, and you have to be really conscious about working with each other's masculine and feminine energy. And I think it would probably create a situation where there's a lot more negotiation. So yeah, that's the thing to be more mindful of when it comes to where there's ease of energy transfer and where there's blocks of energy transfer. And again, there's so many different ways that charts can be combined, and so many like different things that can be happening in this kind of dynamic, and a lot of interpretations of what that might mean. But if you keep coming back to the basics, that the sun always chases the moon, Mars always chases Venus, and compatible signs and polarities tend to be good. Good, like harmonious aspects also tends to be good for energy transfer, whereas incompatible elements or polarities and harsher aspects tend to be more challenging. Then it's pretty self-explanatory. However, if it's not, if you have a more complicated chart and it's a little bit harder to read, I am going to add some extra standard readings to my readings, the readings that I have offered. And I'll add on ones specifically how to read masculine, feminine, relational dynamics to my standard readings. So in my standard readings, there's 3 kinds of readings, and one of them is for Synastry charts. So I'll add one of those extra readings to read the Synastry for masculine and feminine dynamics to my standard readings. So that if you're struggling, if this video hasn't been helpful enough, especially if you have lots of kind of different things going on, it's kind of hard to make sense of what the pattern is and what the overall kind of big picture is, I'll have that available for you. So if you go to the link in my description box, you should be able to find my astrology readings, which at this time that I'm recording this video are open, and then you can request a standard reading and I can do this for you. Regardless, I hope you found this video interesting, insightful, informative, to at least help you start to get a understanding of the masculine and feminine dynamics in both an individual chart and a Synastry chart. It has been a pleasure doing my absolute best to explain it as simply as possible and give you some step-by-step instructions about what to look for in what order and what it means, so that you can try to do this yourself at home. Let me know how it went. If you figured out what your personal masculine or feminine energy dynamic is and what your Synastry dynamic is, potentially with someone else. If you did find it helpful, I would love if you could like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps me with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps me to make more videos like this, teaching you more things about astrology. So yeah, I would love if you could leave me a little like, comment, and subscribe. And until we see each other again, thanks so much for watching. Cheers.